So just a quick, there goes the recording. So quick introduction to BNRC. Berkshire Natural Resources Council is a regional land trust working throughout Berkshire County on land conservation, land stewardship, and community engagement. Since 1967, our mission has been to protect and preserve the natural beauty and ecological integrity of the Berkshires for public benefit and enjoyment, which means protecting land, building trails, caring for the land, and connecting people to nature, among other efforts. Over the last few years, we've focused on educating ourselves, and by we, I mean staff, board, and our community, educating ourselves and exploring the question of what does our mission mean when viewed through a lens that centers on equity and inclusion. The staff and board have committed to learning, growing, evolving, really challenging ourselves and pushing deeper and understanding how we can do better and what more we can do to integrate those questions into the work that we've been doing for over 50 years. And luckily, we have some wonderful partners that we've been working with on this as well. So today, this effort involves gaining a deeper understanding of cultural appropriation. What is it? What does it mean? Why it's harmful? And how we can all do better. Words matter. With that, I hand it off to Mackenzie.
Thanks, Jenny. Please join us in welcoming Heather Bruegl, who will be leading this workshop today. Heather is a citizen of the United Nation of Wisconsin and first-line descendant of the Stockbridge-Munsee. She's a graduate of Madonna University in Michigan and holds a Bachelor of Arts and Masters of Arts in U.S. History. Her research comprises numerous topics related to American history, legacies of colonialization, and indigeneity, including the Dakota War of 1812, the history of American boarding schools, and missing and murdered Indigenous women. Heather consults for a variety of museums and universities and is a frequent lecturer at conferences and topics ranging from intergenerational racism and trauma to the fight for clean water in the Native community. Heather is the former director of education of Forge Project, a decolonial art and education initiative in the unceded homelands of the Mohicaniac in upstate New York, where she organized public programming and events and led the Forge Project Fellowship Program. Now Heather is a public historian, activist, and independent consultant who works with institutions and organizations for Indigenous sovereignty and collective liberation. BNRC is grateful to Heather for joining its board of directors, for bringing her voice and experience to the organization. Thank you, Heather, for sharing this workshop with so many people here today. You're welcome to start sharing.
Thank you, my pleasure. Okay. I am super stoked to be able to share this today with you. Hit the wrong button. Okay, there we go. I'm really excited to be able to share this with you. I know if you joined us last time, we talked about late acknowledgements, and this time we're talking about cultural appropriation and why words matter. It's something that I have found over and over that, there are phrases and things that we do or say that are part of everyday life that people don't realize can be super harmful. And so that is why I put together this workshop, because I was seeing it more and more. And if I'm going to be involved with an organization and consulting or whatever, it's like, you know what, let's take a look at what we're doing. Are we doing harmful things? Are we doing things to combat this harm and stuff like that? And then of course, moving out here to New York, I'm shocked. I'm shocked by what I see when I drive down the road to the grocery store. I see two huge examples of cultural appropriation on the way to the grocery store. And like, part of me is like, one of them, I live like right near a diner. I don't know if you know the West Iconic Diner in New York. And like, it has this big sign. It's a really cool diner. The food's really good. But it has this really big sign that's like an Indigenous person in a headdress. So of course, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm totally like offended by that. That's not appropriate. But then also, I'm also baffled because it's not even like inappropriate or racist in the correct way, because Native people out east did not wear full headdresses. So they didn't even get that right. And I'm like, if you're going to at least be inappropriate, do it, be inappropriate appropriately. So from like a historical perspective, I'm like, that's not even accurate. So it's really interesting for me. So I put together this workshop. I've done it for a number of organizations already. And it's not in any way, shape, or form put together to make anyone feel bad about something that they've said, because we've all said inappropriate things, but it's just be mindful and be aware. So I'm going to go through this PowerPoint. I'm going to show like a quick 2-minute video at the end, and then we'll have Q&A. There is one interactive portion of this, and we'll utilize the chat for that. I find people are more truthful when they can just type it in instead of unmuting themselves and talking. But please know we'll have Q&A at the end, and that'll be facilitated by BNRC. But again, I'm so thankful to be on the board of directors for BNRC and to be able to do this workshop. So thank you guys so much. I'm super excited. So we'll go ahead and get started. And I apologize if my internet is spotty because I'm in a different part of the house, but it should be okay. We acknowledge that we are all coming from different locations that were the ancestral homes of Indigenous nations. I've written this particular land acknowledgement for where I am sitting. In upstate New York, we acknowledge the Mahikaniak, the people of the waters that are never still. We acknowledge that through forced land cession and removal, this nation was removed from the land they called home, and their seat of government is now located in Wisconsin, and they're known as the Stockbridge-Munsee community today. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present. We understand that this acknowledgement is just a first step in the process of building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. Mackenzie already introduced me, but just really quickly, in case you didn't hear that or you didn't know, my name is Heather. I am enrolled Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, first line descendant Stockbridge-Munsee. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I currently work as a historian and independent consultant, focusing in on Indigenous history. You can get me at that Gmail address you see on your screen. You can also follow me on Twitter, where I do a lot of museum interaction on Twitter. You can follow me on Instagram, where I post just random things, but also lots of pictures of my dogs. So if you want to see my dogs, you can go to Instagram. To also, if you want to get a hold of me, another way is through my website, heatherbruegl.com. So just a little about me. Now we're going to move into the hardcore stuff. What is cultural appropriation? Cultural appropriation is defined as the use of objects or elements of a non-dominant culture in a way that doesn't respect the traditional meaning of something or give proper credit to and helps perpetuate a harmful stereotype. The main point of that is perpetuates a harmful stereotype. So cultural appropriation is definitely something that can be harmful. It can cause harm on a group of people, especially if they are the group whose things and traditions or whatever are being appropriated. Knowledge, cultural expression, or artifacts from someone else's culture without permission. And you can find more about that in Who Owns Culture, Appropriation, and Authenticity in American Law. So it takes something that belongs to you and puts it out into the universe for being used. One of the things that I've noticed that does cultural appropriation a lot, I don't know if it's intentional, I don't know if it's unintentional, what have you, but New Age religion and the use of medicines tend to appropriate Indigenous culture a lot of times. So a lot of people, I think it was it's happened a lot since the pandemic, but even before then it was getting really big. The use of sage to cleanse. If it is how you use it in ceremony, you're appropriating it. You're appropriating it. There are special teachings that are behind that go with the use of sage that I abide to in my life, but not everybody knows those. So if you're not abiding by those, if you're not getting your teachings and practicing ceremony correctly, you are appropriating it. And so that is something that I see that happens a lot. And we're going to cover a few different examples in this. But again,
excuse me,
it's taking that intellectual, yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
Heather, you are breaking up a little bit. I hate to ask you to do this, but if you, maybe you stop your video, and that might help a little bit. We'd love to see your face too, but
Yeah.
I think it might help a bit.
Yeah, I was hoping, but you can see a picture of me.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
Sorry
I
to
know
interrupt.
I didn't want to like have to do that, but we have to do that sometimes. So, but again, it's using intellectual property, traditional knowledge, and cultural expression or artifacts without the permission of that group. So that's important. It's also going to the next slide. Okay, cultural appropriation also falls on a spectrum. So there isn't like a one size fits all. Appropriation falls on different levels. Using a derogatory term and mascot for Indigenous people, and they're just different levels of awful. So they're both bad. You should not use Indigenous to describe your group of friends. But I think we can all agree that the use of mascots is way worse than using a word inappropriately. So while they're still bad, they're just different levels of bad. Mascots are definitely a bigger deal than using the term spirit animal, but they're both equally wrong. There are healthy ways to use Native words and phrases that are centered with Indigenous people leading the way. Unfortunately, the way most Native phrases and images are used in general are used in a derogatory way that is disrespectful and upholds a stereotype. So why does it happen? Why does cultural appropriation happen? There's a number of reasons. In the contemporary United States, there is an unspoken and unconscious bias that implies that everyone has the right to use Native American and Indigenous imagery as they see fit, right? We were a conquered people, quote unquote. So those outside think that they can use us however they see fit. There's a sense of entitlement that you get to do whatever you want with our imagery, our words, our phrases that invoke our culture. That is white privilege. Thinking you can do that without any consequences is white privilege. Native Americans are portrayed in two different ways in US society and in history, really. The first way that we're portrayed is the good Indian, those who helped the Europeans, those who brought food, those who took them fishing, all of those things. Then there's the bad Indian, those who resisted Europeans and resisted colonization. These representations often mask the realities of tribal nations struggling to maintain their population, lands, resources, and sovereignty. There are over 574 federally recognized Native nations. They are tribes, nations, pueblos, communities, and villages. 229 of those are ethnically and culturally nations that are located in Alaska, and the others are located in 35 states across the United States. Trauma is also a source that leads to cultural appropriation. As a historian, I root everything in historical context. So this just goes back a little to bring some context to it. So there have been acts of violence carried out against Native people since the founding of the United States. These acts have included genocide, theft of land and natural resources, enslavement, forced removal, and boarding schools. And that violence continues today. Native people suffer violence at much higher rates than any other group in the United States. According to the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, which we have all become intimately aware of the past couple of years, have said that the third leading cause of death amongst murder. The third leading cause of death. So the CDC has basically come out and said that my third leading cause of death is murder. We suffer rates of violence higher than any other population in the United States. And that violence of the past continues today. Rates of suicide, trauma, and depression are historically high. This is a result of based policy and discrimination that has all had a lasting impact. In fact, in 2013, on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, it like butts right up to Nebraska. It's in the western part of South Dakota. In 2013, that reservation declared a state of emergency. A state of emergency because the rates of suicide amongst their young people were so high. They had to call in the federal government, ask for help. This trauma, though, is pushed aside most of the time, and it's the Indigenous person that is represented as, quote, the bloodthirsty savage, and the colonist is painted as the innocent victim. Language has also been used as a weapon against Indigenous people. There were over 300 native languages that existed in the United States prior to colonization. But there were government measures put in place, such as the creation of mission and government boarding schools. These schools had an English-only policy. Indigenous language was looked at as something that was dirty and distasteful and needed to be wiped out. I remember talking to my mom because my grandparents and my great-grandparents went to boarding schools. They were boarding school survivors. So I asked my mom one time if she ever heard my grandma speak any of our Oneida language. And she said, no, I never heard her speak it at all. And it took me a minute to realize why, but my grandma went to a mission boarding school. They could only speak English there. That was the only language they were allowed to speak. So of course, she didn't know any words. She didn't know anything. Same with my grandparents, my grandpa, and same with my great-grandparents. My great-grandparents went to Carlisle, which is in Pennsylvania out here. Carlisle was awful. That was an awful boarding school. So it's, the language was wiped out completely. And language has also become a mechanism of control. Indigenous words were taken and used against Native people. So words that we used in our everyday language were taken and they were turned to racial slurs. So savage, squaw, chief, redskin. And then in more recent history, thanks to the leader of the last administration, Pocahontas became a racial slur. Like, that's not a racial slur. Pocahontas was a victim of sexual assault, violence. She was taken from her homelands and she died in a foreign country. She is a fighter and a survivor, not a racial slur. And it's been used that way. Her name has been used that way. The use of language as control has also made its way into Hollywood, as well as our scripts that are written for fictional Native characters. There's a term in Hollywood that was used way back when. It's called Tonto speak, and it's usually described as that, and it includes the use of and me instead of the use of the word I. So instead of saying I am hungry, it's me am hungry. So it really like dumbs down the Indigenous person and makes them sound like something that they're completely not. But it's also important to point out that through this all, while Indigenous language was taken away from Native nations, there was a time the U.S. actually needed Indigenous language. And that time was during World War II with the Navajo Code Talkers. They needed the language in order to get messages across to our soldiers and use a code that wasn't broken. The Navajo language is very complex. It wasn't written down. It was hard to understand if you didn't know it. So it was the best language to use at that time. So there's this idea of your language is bad, you can't use it, you can only speak English, but we kind of also need you to use your language to help us win this war against fascism. But then when you're done, we don't need you to speak it anymore because you should be speaking English. So there's this like mental game that's going on, which is really awful, which causes continued trauma. Mascots, I think, are the biggest form of cultural appropriation that we have. The use of Indigenous people as mascots has also been a source of trauma for Native nations. Mascots have very little, if anything, to do with Indigenous people. They do not represent Indigenous people at all. And what they actually do, though, is reinforce the fundamental features of racial and gendered privilege in a settler colonial society. In particular, it gives a sense of entitlement to a settler colonial society to take and remake what Native American culture is without consent and without historical knowledge, without realizing how traumatic that can be for a group of people. Having mascots such as braves, chiefs, Indians, savages, etc., invoke an unhealthy idea of who Native Americans are. and lead people to think that the Native Americans are bloodthirsty and violent. Having these mascots also lead fans to think it's okay to attend games dressed in war paint or wear red face, refer to themselves as Indians, and wear symbols that are considered sacred to Native communities. Headdresses are sacred to those communities who use them. Every single feather means something. It's important. Calling yourself the whatever Indians just is a disservice to those of us who actually are Indigenous. Granted, Indian is a word that you don't want to use a lot, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, but it's also like you're not. I was working with a school board. I've worked with a couple of school boards here in the state of New York, and there's one school board south of here that is south of where I'm at that's kind of dragging their feet, but their school mascot is Indians. And so when school season starts and when their football season starts, they put up this big sign that says welcome to Indian country. I'm like, what? If an Indigenous nation were to put up that sign that said welcome to Indian country, people would be pissed. They would be so mad. But here's this school who is like, welcome to Indian country. Now, yeah, you're on land. You actually happen to be on the land of my ancestors. But like, no, you don't get to do that. You're appropriating that. And it's really interesting. And I know there was this big thing that just happened recently in the news with a group that went to Disney who did this. It was a school group, and they did this inappropriate cheer or chant, and it was just awful. So there are schools that are still doing this. Granted, a lot of schools have changed their mascot, and we have had some professional teams change their mascots, but we've also had some who have really just dug their heels in. But it's not a great way to paint Indigenous people. And if you've never encountered an Indigenous person in your life, and this is the only thing that you get to see it, this is the only avenue that shows you Indigenous people, you're getting a false sense of who we are, and it's doing actually a disservice to you as well. So if we think about it in those terms, I think that that's something that is okay. So this is the interactive part. So questions for you. So I'm going to ask each question one at a time. I want you to utilize the chat, type in your answers. We'll go through some of them. I won't go through all of them because obviously I want to be respectful of time, but there is nothing that you can say that's going to offend me because I have literally heard it all. But I want you to be honest. This is honest time, because if you're going to have your organization work in decolonizing yourself and being culturally appropriate, you've got to look within yourself too. So the first question is, have you ever been in the socially awkward situation of being around someone who has said something that is inappropriate and culturally offensive? If you answer yes to that question, what did you do? What didn't you do? That's okay. If you didn't do anything, I'm not going to judge you. I'm not going to judge you because I've heard things before and like I didn't say anything, and I think back on it later. I'm like, oh, I should have said something, but it's okay. There have been other times where I have said something before, but I use it more as a learning part for that person who said something. So take just a minute, think about, the question, and start populating your answers into the chat, and I'll look over a few of them and share them. I won't say names or anything, but yeah, just like, have you been in that situation? And then like, what did you do? What didn't you do? And that's okay. So do that, and we will share in just a moment.
Heather, while folks are adding comments into the chat for you, I just wanted to note that you are breaking up a little bit still. I don't know if it seems like you've sort of done what you can, and we've been able to understand you, and sort of when there's been any kind of a break, I think your slides have certainly helped us stay on track with what you're sharing. But I just wanted to mention that to you.
I can totally try to switch locations in my house too really quick while people are doing this. So I'm going to turn my camera off, and my sound off, just a minute.
Okay.
Okay, I'm now in a different part of my house, closer to the modem. So hopefully this works.
Thank you. Sorry for that.
No. I was like, let me work from this room today. I don't know why I did that. That was stupid. Okay. So we do have lots of things coming into the chat. So I'll just start with this. Yes, did different things in different situations, said something or said nothing, depending on the power dynamics in play. That's important too. Obviously, you want to make sure that you feel safe enough that you can say something. There are some times where you cannot say anything because it's just a dangerous situation. Numerous times I've tried different tactics of calling out versus calling in, but sometimes I just don't say anything either because I don't know what to say or simply do not feel like I had the energy to get into it. I hear that. I hear you on that. Sometimes I don't say anything because I'm so completely shocked by what I just heard that I am just like, I don't even know how to respond to that. Particularly if it comes from like a family member, I'm like, you did not, like, seriously, do you not know who I am? Like, why did, like, oh, it's awful. Often I do nothing, but if I'm with people I know well and there is time, I will suggest different language or that comment was not appropriate. Absolutely. I was once chatting with someone and he used the phrase, um, wow, he used an inappropriate phrase, which means something about being very stingy. I think we all know that phrase. I'm Jewish and was completely shocked, so just turned around and walked away. He chased me and apologized, but I wish I had the ability to confront him immediately. Again, I think that's one of those situations where we're just like, you're shocked, you're stunned, deer in the headlights. Like, you did not just say that. So of course we don't know. And then plus, if it is actually culturally insensitive to you, that's, you just experienced a trauma. So it can be very hard sometimes to say something. Let's see. There's so many. On occasion, called out the person speaking, but not in others. I've been culturally insensitive, but more so in the past. I'm much more aware of the rights of other cultures to set their own standards of what is appropriate and what isn't. Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's see, I'll do two more. I've heard many inappropriate comments and usually try to re-say what they said in a different way. I'm sure I've said insensitive things myself. We all have. And currently in an ongoing conversation with a grieving parent about using white sage, pushing back on the but grief response and suggested alternatives with resources by Indigenous folks. Absolutely, absolutely. So this is the second question. Some of you alluded to this in your comments here, but here's the second question. Have you been the person who has said something culturally insensitive? Do you regret it? Was it recent? Was it a long time ago? What was it? But have you been the person who has said something culturally insensitive? Me? Yes, absolutely. I have. Mine has come definitely out of ignorance. I was raised in a bubble. And so when I hear like I would hear phrases, obviously there were some phrases I definitely heard growing up and I'm like, that's not appropriate. And then there were others that I didn't know were inappropriate. And so I would say something out loud and like, you can't say that. And so I immediately, instead of becoming, I used to get defensive, but now I'm like, oh my gosh, number one, so sorry, no excuse. But now I approach it from a place of education. Can you tell me why that is the way it is? Because I want to know so I don't do it again. And if I hear someone do it, I can then, explain what you just said to me to them. So it's more of coming from a place of education at this point. So have you ever been that person who said something culturally insensitive? So take just a moment and put your stuff into the chat. I see some coming in right now, so I'll give you just another minute. All right, I see some stuff coming in here. Um, Pioneer Valley. Not gonna lie to you, I'm completely ignorant to what that is, but a number of you have commented on it, so I'm assuming it is not a good thing. Reading the one, oh, it looks like the in teaching of Indigenous history, I learned that the Connecticut River Valley would be more culturally sensitive term. Got it. Oh, I get it. I get why it's bad. Pioneer Valley. Yeah, okay. As soon as I learned this, I realized how unthinking the attribution to pioneers would be. Been working for years to educate myself. Enlightenment is a work in progress. That is a fact. Absolutely. I've used and often hear people use the term spirit animal. I think it's considered culturally insensitive and have stopped using it because of my uncertainty. We are going to talk about that term in just a little bit. I'm sure off the reservation has popped out of my mouth. We are also going to talk about that term in just a little bit. I grew up hearing top or bottom of the totem pole. I used this phrase until my mid-20s. We're going to talk about that one in a little while too. Guys like are making my job easier. Also, having trouble with speaking appropriately as we try to make our building and exhibits fully accessible and interactive in different ways. My trouble is language around people with disabilities. That's what I hear a lot. That's what I hear a lot. Please feel free to reach out to me. I can definitely be helpful in that area for you. Another one in regards to Pioneer Valley. I'm from an older demographic and my childhood was full of very inappropriate language. I'm always learning. Good for you for continuing to learn. I grew up hearing and using the term Indian giver. We're going to talk about that one for a while or in a little bit as well. That's also it's not a nice term. There's actually some really though cool historical context on how Indian giver came to be. So we're going to talk about that. You are going to love it. Different stereotypes that are less in the awareness of many folks. I sent a video of a comedian to my mom, and the comedian was making an old people joke about his dad. My mom was so hurt, it really opened my eyes to how normalized ageism is on both ends of the spectrum. Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you guys for sharing those. And again, this is not like, making you feel like you're bad, because we all do it. I have done it. I have done it. And people now look to me like, am I supposed to say this? This is appropriate. Is it not appropriate? So it's okay. It's okay. We all do it. So with that, we're going to talk about some things you shouldn't say. We're going to talk about some stuff you just shouldn't say. You should steer clear from. So terms and phrases that non-native people use can be looked at as microaggressions, but they can be easily unlearned if the non-native person takes the time to learn about the history or origins of the words and phrases. Many of these terms and phrases seem to work their way into our everyday vernacular, and most of the time, non-native people don't even realize they're saying something hurtful, that you don't know it. Again, I've said some stuff in the past, and I'm like, oh, I didn't know that was a bad thing. I didn't know that. Like, and for example, like I didn't know that gypsy was a bad thing. Didn't know that at all until I learned how it can be very derogatory, and that how those who one would classify as gypsies are actually Roma people. And I'm like, oh my God, thank you so much for telling me. So it's you don't know what you don't know. So hopefully today we cover a lot of these things and you leave going, okay, I know that now. I know not to say it. Or if you hear someone say it, you can like, oh, you shouldn't do that. So the first one, which someone did bring this up in the chat, is spirit animal. This word is almost always framed as a joke and used to describe a plethora of things by non-native people. For example, if you're familiar with the show Schitt's Creek, if you're not familiar with it, you need to watch it. You have to watch it. Number two, I very much can relate to David Rose in that show. I don't know if that's good or bad. I don't know what that says about me, but I love David Rose. And so like David Rose is my spirit animal, but I should not use that term in that way because it can be extremely harmful. So even me as an Indigenous person, I can slip and say something that I'm like, oh, I shouldn't be saying that. There are many Native nations that do have spiritual traditions that include or incorporate animals or spiritual helpers. These helpers appear in a person's time of need. So when you hear an Indigenous person sincerely talking about their spirit animal, it's because in a time of need, when they were in ceremony or they were praying to Creator, this animal appeared to them. And that animal can be any form. It could be a wolf, it could be a bear, it could be a turtle, it could be, whatever. That Creator sends that spirit animal, that animal to help you in your time of need. So that is why that phrase can be extremely harmful and detrimental. So I tend to not use that term anymore when I remember. So tribe is also a word that you should steer clear from. Again, the levels fall, cultural appropriation falls on different levels. And so this would be a low one, but it's still bad. This term is used a lot by people to describe their group of friends, or you see it on novelty t-shirts and mugs and all of that. Corporate America uses this term in context of team building. But the term actually diminishes and helps erase the long-fought battles that Native nations or tribes have had in order to be federally recognized. And that federally recognized status means something. It means something very, very big. Native tribes have passed down ancestral knowledge, ceremony, and oral tradition. And while many Native nations don't always refer to themselves as tribes, historically, using that word means something. So when you are with your group of friends, you can easily say that you're with your group, your family, your support team, or your community. You don't have to use the word tribe. Squaw. This word is usually always, like 100% of the time, used in a derogatory way towards Indigenous women in particular. It is used as a racial slur and can be equated to calling a woman a slut or a whore. And even if the word is used in Native communities, which it is, it doesn't mean you get to use it. So squaw was actually not a term that started out meaning anything different. It meant like partner, woman, in some languages, virtuous woman, right? But non-Native people took that term and made it nasty. They made it nasty. So nasty that the Department of the Interior has actually come out with like a list of words that if these words are in national parks or things like that, they need to be taken out of. And squaw actually appears a lot. And it's just a nasty term now. So if you hear it though being used in Indigenous communities, that's because we've reclaimed it. We've taken it back. Doesn't mean you get to use it though. Sports teams called chiefs or Indians. Again, this goes back to the idea of mascots. So Native Americans have been depicted as caricatures, reducing an entire culture down to a cartoon. Reducing a group of people down to a mascot takes away the history that's already erased. In addition to that, most sports teams are owned exclusively by white people, which only perpetuates the trauma of forced removal, genocide, and is overall insulting. In 2020, the Washington football team retired its mascot. And in Canada, the Canadian Football League team, the Edmonton Eskimos, actually dropped the term Eskimo from their team name, which leads to the next term, Eskimo. It is a term that is used by non-Native people as an umbrella term for all Indigenous peoples in the Arctic. It kind of lumps them all into one. The term should only be used by those in the Indigenous community who identify and are comfortable with using that term. Again, it's one of those, you don't get to use it even though it's being used in the community. The term is also lumped in with every expression like Eskimo kisses, those little nose kisses. It's based off a myth that Inuits do this, but they don't. That's very much a whitewashing of an activity. So Inuit people do not do the little nose kisses, and they're not called Eskimo kisses. So steer clear of that one. Indian. Little debate on this one. Indian has been a term that has been used to describe the Indigenous peoples of North America and is considered very inappropriate by some. The term seems to stem back to when Columbus thought he was in the East Indies when he was really in the Caribbean, and called the inhabitants of the islands Indians because he thought he was in the East Indies. He was not. He was a very, very bad navigator. And it's a term that then kind of spun off and was used by colonizers. So, but it's used a lot though, even in today's in 2022. Some people are fine with using it as to describe themselves. It's written into many federal policies and laws. So for example, I do a lot of work with federal Indian policy and American Indian law. So it's written in there. And then even some tribal nations have the word in their federally recognized name. So like the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin, they're the Menominee Indians of Wisconsin. So it's like it's written in there. So that one is definitely one that I equate to pronouns. If you're not sure, ask, because every Indigenous person is going to tell you differently. It's not a term that I would use to describe myself, even though it is a term that I use a lot in my work when discussing federal policy. So always ask if you're not sure on that one. Other phrases to steer clear and watch out for. Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. When Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, there were already Indigenous people living there. You can't discover something that wasn't lost in some place where 10 million to 100 million people were already living. It wasn't new. It wasn't new. So don't say that. Don't say that phrase. Another one to steer clear from. Hey, chief. This phrase has the ability to trivialize both those who are actually hereditary chiefs or those who have been elected into office by their nation. The phrase just being thrown around can make people uncomfortable, and it can be very disrespectful. Too many chiefs and not enough Indians. This is a phrase that has become so common in our everyday vernacular that no one seems to think twice about it. This phrase is often used in a corporate setting. Regardless of when or how it is used, it's imperative to not use it at all. Another phrase, circle the wagons. This basically translates to, quote, the Indians are coming and we're about to be attacked. It's harmful because more often than not, it was the Indigenous people who were the ones being attacked, and the attackers were the colonists, not the other way around. Keep the natives at bay and hold down the fort kind of go together. Hold down the fort implies that this is a phrase that from settler and soldiers building forts in Indian country to keep the natives out, to keep the natives at bay, keep them away. They're a little nuts. We need to keep them away. It implies that Native Americans are on the warpath and that they are savages. They're on the warpath. Deciding to go to war is never an easy decision for any type of nation, tribal nation or not a tribal nation. It's a hard decision. Leaders, Indigenous leaders take not just days, they take not just weeks, but months and years to make a decision to go to war. You don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. And most of the time, it was the last decision that a Native nation ever wanted to make. The phrase again implies that Native people are bloodthirsty and out for war. We're not. We're not at all. We should powwow about that. Powwows are social gatherings in the Native community that are for ceremony and celebration purposes. The dance and ceremonies performed at powwow are conducted under traditional rules and protocol. A business meeting is not a powwow. A business meeting is a business meeting. I was on an Amtrak train a couple years ago. I can't remember if I was going to Michigan or if I was coming back from Michigan, but Wisconsin was rolling there and I can't remember where I was going. But the person behind us, I was on the train with my husband, the person sitting behind us was on his cell phone having a very loud conversation. And fine, whatever. He was very happy. He got a new apartment. He and his girlfriend were moving to Chicago. Everything was going to be amazing. And he was talking about, oh yeah, when I get into town, we should powwow about that. And I was like, what? So that was one of the moments where I decided, you know what, I'm going to say something. So when he got off of his phone, I just stood up and I walked to the seat behind me and I sat down like right next to him. And I was like, Number one, congratulations on your new apartment. I'm very excited for you. But number two, I was like, you use this term, I'm an Indigenous person, yada, yada, yada. And I went to my whole spiel. So I kind of used it as like a teaching moment. And he was like, to my surprise, he was very like, you know what, you're right. He's like, I went to Central Michigan University, which used to be Central Michigan Chippewas, but now they're just like the Flying Seas. And he's like, we have Indigenous population at that college, had powwow every year. He's like, I should have known about her. And I was like, oh my gosh, it was great conversation. So it's like, he was totally fine about that. And he was accepting. So I used it instead of saying, you shouldn't do this, you blah, blah, blah. I was like, dude, this is why you shouldn't use it. And I explained why. So yeah, a business meeting is a business meeting. It's not a powwow. If you want to go to a powwow, by all means, please go to a powwow. But your conversations around your water cooler, those are not powwows. Next one, rain dance. For some Native nations, rain dance is an actual ceremony used to bring a fruitful harvest. It isn't a way to control the weather and shouldn't be used as such. I would love if I could be able to control the weather, but I can't. Nobody can. It's raining and gloomy today by me today. We don't have ceremony dances that control the weather, so don't think that we do. This one was also brought up in the chat, low man on the totem pole. In some Native nations, totem poles are actually very sacred items to that nation and to the people who carve and display them. These figures carved on the poles represent family history, clans, and important events. And in addition to that, in some communities, being low on that totem pole is actually a higher honor. So if you're trying to insult someone by saying you're the low man on the totem pole, you may have inadvertently given them a compliment in some communities. So that's just something. When I found that out, I was like, oh, snap, I didn't know that. So I started reading more about totem poles and I was like, oh, I get it. It totally makes sense. So there we go. Indian time and Indian summer. The first implies that all Indians are late, and the later implies that summer is late. So you're equating a group of people to a season that we have no control over. You may have good intentions, but when you use the later phrase, remember it gives it a negative connotation. There's negative connotations in that, Indian time, Indian summer. This one was also brought up in the chat, Indian giver. The phrase is most often used in a derogatory way, always negative. The phrase was first coined, though, we believe, in 1765 in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Quote, an Indian gift is a proverbial expression signifying a phrase for which an equivalent return is expected, end quote. There are two different schools of thought on how the phrase originated to mean what it means today. One being that it stemmed from the US signing treaties with Native nations and then breaking the treaties. However, I'm not sure how that would imply that we were the Indian givers in that point. The other being of a clash of cultures with settlers, not understanding the bartering system that is in with Native nations. So the Native nation gives a gift, and if not one is received in return, it's a sign of disrespect. So then that nation asks for the gift back. So I give you a token of appreciation for something, you don't give me one back. I'm like, what's up with you? Apparently we're not besties. I'm going to ask for my gift back because we're clearly not on the same page. That would offend settlers, and then the phrase was born. But it was really just a way of them not understanding how our system worked. So the last one, this was also brought up in the chat too, off the reservation. The phrase implies that one is not thinking correctly or that one is of not sound mind. In the United system, when the reservation system was created, Indigenous people were actually forcibly kept on reservations and could not leave without permission. Being off the reservation was a privilege. You had to get you still had to get like a day pass, but being able to leave the reservation was a privilege. You were forcibly kept on it otherwise. And then obviously there are questionable questions that you should never ask an Indigenous person. And yes, I've been asked both of these numerous times. The first one, why can't you people just get over it? Like for real. like someone asked me that and I'm like, really? If you are aware of the horrors and atrocities that Indigenous people of North America had to endure, you would never ask that question. You would never ask it. And the second question I have, yes, been asked to my face is, how Indian are you? That's so inappropriate. It's intrusive and it's insensitive. And it also brings up the long storied trauma that we have with blood quantum, and how that affects, quote, how Indian you are. So never ask those questions to Indigenous people or people of color in general. Don't ask those questions, especially the why can't you get over it? Because if you understood the atrocities, you would never ask those. But yes, I have like to my face and been asked both. It's insane. So I finally want to just leave you with this. As educational and cultural facilities, you have the opportunity to do better and to be better. It's totally doable. Museums are not neutral. Cultural institutions are not neutral. And it's the responsibility of those institutions to tell the truth, the good, the bad, and the ugly. We have the power to change people's minds and to teach them something they may have not learned before. We have the power to control that. We have the power to control the narratives that we tell, whether it is in our cultural facility, our shared land space, things like that, along our trails that we maintain for people. We still have the power to tell the narrative in a way that is teaching. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen really quick because I just want to share the video that I have for you. It's literally like 2 minutes long. And this video was made in response to the Washington football team. Not at the time, they were not wanting to change their mascot. They eventually did change it. But this video, I still think is so important because it shares who we are as Indigenous people. And it was created by the National Congress of the American Indian. And it's a video that I truly love. So I'm just going to play it for you, and then we can move to Q&A. So here we go.
Proud, forgotten, Indian, Navajo, Blackfoot, Inuit, and Sioux, survivor, spiritualist, patriot, Sitting Bull, Hiawatha, and Jim Thorpe, mother, father, son, daughter, chief, Apache, Pueblo, Choctaw, Chippewa, and Crow, underserved, struggling, resilient, Squanto, Red Cloud, Tecumseh, and Crazy Horse, rancher, teacher, doctor, soldier, Seminole, Seneca, Mohawk, and Creek, Mills, Will Rogers, Geronimo, unyielding, strong, indomitable. Native Americans call themselves many things. The one thing they don't.
So obviously that video was made during the mascot fight with the Washington football team, but I think it still says a lot. I think it's, it shows how diverse we are, the things that we refer to ourselves as those in our community who've made huge differences. And I think that's really important. And I think, seeing that video also gives more of why cultural appropriation is such a thing that we need to combat and make sure that we are being as culturally sensitive as possible. So with that, I will open it up to any Q&A that we have. And also thank you guys for being part of this and learning a little something that maybe that you didn't know before.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Heather. At this time, you can either raise your virtual hand and we can call on you to ask your question, or feel free to input them into the chat and we'll keep track of them there. So I'm not seeing any hand raised. We do have a couple of questions that we compiled for you just to get the questions rolling. Just wondering if you have any resources to share for continued learning, books, podcasts, anything like that.
Yes, I do. I have, oh my gosh, on the computer, I actually have a very long list, which I will give some suggestions now. And then Mariah, I will send you this list and you can send it out to like whoever wants it. So some of my favorite podcasts to listen to are Red Nation Podcast, This Land, Return to Thunder Bay, and Leonard Political Prisoner. Those you can get on your Apple Podcasts. Both of those, or all of those, I really like for really different reasons, but they're really good to listen to. Red Nation Podcast is actually hosted by Nick Estes, who is a historian, and they cover a plethora of different issues. This Land, there's 2 seasons out. That's hosted by Rebecca Nagel. And the first season covers the McGirt v. Oklahoma Supreme Court case, which is a case about land. So really, really important. And then the second season talks about ICWA, which is the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is currently being threatened right now. And so that was a really good one. Return to Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay is in Canada, and there's a high rate of murder. And it's Indigenous people that are being murdered. So Thunder Bay kind of delves into like, why is that a thing? And then Leonard Political Prisoner. I think there's 2 seasons out. That covers Leonard Peltier and the stuff that happened to him during the American Indian movement. I have no opinions one way or the other. I'm not going to share my opinions one way or the other, but this kind of takes a look at the case and how he ended up in prison. But it's really good. Documentaries. Reel, REEL, Real Engine is a really good documentary, and that talks about how Indigenous people are portrayed in film and media. So when I talked about that Tonto speak in the beginning, when we talked about language being weaponized, Real Engine actually covers that. It's really, really good. Love that one. Of course, there's tons more books I would recommend. Heartbeat of Wounded Knee by David Troyer. Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. And I'll give you one more. Lakota Woman by Mary Crow Dog covers her activism during her time of the American Indian movement. So yeah, so I do have a long list, so I will send that to you and then you can send it out to the participants because it's a lot, because I recommend a lot of stuff.
Sounds great. Thank you. Yeah, we'll send that resource list out with the recording.
Great. Thank you, Heather. A question came in from Vivian who asks, who says, thank you for your very informative presentation. And she wonders, how can we be more culturally sensitive when discussing herbs and plants used medicinally by natives?
Include natives in that discussion. Have them be part of that discussion with you. Every time I don't talk a lot about Indigenous plants and what they were used for because I don't know a lot. But when people want to to know more, I definitely recommend them to people that I know that know more, that I have included in talks. And so one of the books that I would actually recommend that you get is Medicine Generations by Misty Cook. She is a Stockbridge-Munsee community member, and Misty knows all about the medicines. So I would make sure you include her or other Indigenous people in that conversation when you're talking about the use of plants.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from Charlotte, and it really speaks to the question that was just asked, but how can we refer to plants with inappropriate names such as Indian pipe? How can we explain to an audience why such names are inappropriate?
I mean, I think you can, what helps is, again, because I'm a historian, so everything has historical basis, but if you can, know why it was called that, what it was called beforehand, and refer to it as its indigenous name as much as possible, I think that is super helpful. Knowing how said thing got its name is really helpful. And then that helps kind of explain, the past versus today, like why it is today. But then also like breaking the cycle, like don't refer to it as that, refer to it back to its indigenous name. And the more you do that, maybe it just catches on and it continues to change.
Thank you.
A next question. So this one's a little bit, has some context that's shared. Can you speak about the fine line between appreciation and appropriation? For example, your description about the use of sage versus the example she's sharing is using a dream catcher. The specific question is, if I acknowledge my lack of knowledge, or I acknowledge the source of use of sage and give credit to an Indigenous community, would that fall more on the side of appreciation? Maybe the question is, how do we shift from appropriation to appreciation in an appropriate way?
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I do think there's a very fine line between appreciation and appropriation. I think in terms of using medicines, if you use medicines without that knowledge, you haven't learned from an Indigenous medicine keeper or anything like that, and you're doing it without the proper teachings, that's appropriating. I think if you use those proper teachings and you have permission of the Indigenous medicine holders or elders, and you know those teachings and you're doing it in good faith, that borders more on appreciation. But I think it's talking with those Indigenous community members. It's understanding the stories, the teachings behind all of that. It's not just going to your local herb place and buying medicine and doing that. And that's the other thing though too. I have a hard time with people buying medicines. Medicines should not be bought. We like to boast in the Indigenous community, we have free healthcare. And so you don't buy medicine. So like I get my medicines from, I still actually get my medicines from people out in Wisconsin. But when I do that, there's like this bartering system that goes on. So it's like, like for example, I got some medicines from Misty one time when I was actually still living in Wisconsin. I am one of the many migraine sufferers in the world. And so she had gotten me some chamomile and I think some catnip and some other things to use. And so I didn't know that you didn't pay for medicine. So I was ready to like pay her for them. And she's like, no, I can't do that. She's like, I kind of, barter for them, whatever. Well, I'm also very good at crocheting. So I made like washcloths and slippers and, it was like a trade. So there was no money exchanging hands, things like that. So it's important to understand the practices and appreciate the practices and not kind of colonize them in a capitalistic way, which I think sometimes can happen. And I think that leads to appropriation, because then it makes me wonder, if you're paying for said medicines, where's that money going? Is it benefiting an Indigenous community? So on and so forth. So I understand there is a lot of curiosity around ceremonies, medicines, and things that we do in the Indigenous community, but also understand too, you're not going to get knowledge to everything. There's possibilities that when you ask an Indigenous person about the teachings around sage, they're going to tell you no. That's just going to happen. They're going to tell you no sometimes. And you have to then accept that and say, okay, you know what? Thank you. I'm going to move on from here. So appreciating also means when you're told no, that you drop it and you move forward.
Thank you. Another question, can you comment on the adoption of Indigenous Peoples Day by states? Was the process appropriate? Could it have been improved? And sort of a follow-up to this is how do you think organizations like BNRC could acknowledge this holiday?
I think the adoption of Indigenous Peoples Day by states, in my opinion, is happening too slow. I think it should be adopted at the federal level. I don't think we need Columbus Day. I know there's a lot of people in the Italian community who are like, but our Italian heritage, and like me, I'm like, I get that, I respect that, but there are way more other really cool Italian people that you can honor than a genocidal maniac. So, and technically, Columbus wouldn't be considered Italian because Genoa was not part of Italy at the time when he was born. That's just a whole other side thing. But so I think, you know, at the federal level, I do think we need a recognition of that. I don't think it's too much to ask. I think organization-wise, or any organization, not just BNRC, but any organization, I think having the inclusion of Indigenous Peoples Day on your calendar is really important. I think centering Indigenous histories that day with Indigenous voices is also something that is really important. You know, if we're talking in terms of land trusts and land conservancies in general, maybe you have walking trails or something that you're maintaining, your programming can be centered around being on those trails, being led by an Indigenous person, learning Indigenous history as you're going on your hikes or you're having picnic lunches or whatever. There's a lot that you can do. There's not one organization that can come out and say, well, we have, you know, nothing to do with Indigenous history because we're this type of organization. No, you do. You can always fit Indigenous history into your organization, more than just in the month of November when it's Native American Heritage Month. So it's important for organizations of all shapes and sizes and of all institution likes to make sure you're incorporating Indigenous Peoples Day, because I mean, I foresee it happening sometime soon, that it goes federally. And so we got to be prepared, but then also understand that our history fits in throughout the rest of the year. So March was Women's History Month. Include Indigenous women in that history month. February was Black History Month. Include Afro-Indigenous history in that month as well. So we can do it throughout the year.
Thank you. That's really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question from someone about how to reach Misty Cook by email. She has her book and agrees it's very good. Perhaps should she reach out directly to you to get that to figure, or maybe share her contact? How would you suggest she go about that?
I would suggest, just because I don't want to like overrun Misty's inbox,
Of course,
if you reach out to me and then I will connect you with her. So it's just like one at a time.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. And then the next question was a question if you could speak to some of the work you've done around language with accessibility. And that was a question from Mariah. I don't know if you want to share any more about that, Mariah.
I know when one of the chat comments sort of referenced that and just being careful about, you know, sort of approaching that language, if you could speak to that. And Jane shared, he's very interested.
Yeah. Can you phrase the question again?
Yeah, I guess you had talked about early on when we had sort of the chat option, someone brought up them having just some trouble, and Jane, feel free to unmute if you want to comment on this more specifically, but in terms of just framing a space as welcoming to folks with disabilities and just trying to figure out how to talk about that. And you said maybe you could, you know, serve a purpose in guiding them through that. So just wondering if you have experience with that or similarly resources associated.
Yeah, so I think, you know, I'm married to somebody who has chronic illness, who, as his disease progresses, you know, his accessibility issues become more prevalent. And so I'm acutely aware of his needs. And so I actually I'm working with a group in Massachusetts right now who is rebuilding a building on their property. And in terms, one of the design meetings that we had was talking about accessibility, and the designers wanted to put the more accessible entrances in a completely different part of the building, as opposed to like the main entrances and things like that. And I was like, why would we do that? Why would we completely segregate them out and say, oh, you have to come in this way, as opposed to coming in the front entrance? I'm like, that's to me, that just like struck like a nerve that wasn't like appropriate. But then also, and so like when I talked about that, and I was like, there's clearly space in the front of this building where you can have the entrances, you know, here's the entrances for people who don't have accessibility issues, and here's the entrances for people who do, and they can be right in the same center. And if we're designing this building with Indigenous intentions in mind, we're all the same, we're all one family. In terms of museums and things like that, whether it comes to accessibility issues for movement, sight, hearing, there's also things that we can do to make those more, you can have, you know, the signage, you can have audible signage, you can incorporate Braille, you can have guides that are trained to be with people who do have whatever accessibility issue that it is, to help them have that same experience. You can make walking trails wider, easier to get through. You can provide, you know, maybe walkers or wheelchairs that are equipped, that they can like rent out or something for the day, that are equipped with, you know, the tire treads to get through a trail. You know, they make these really cool wheelchairs now. They look like bike tires, and I'm like, dude, you could like, I don't know, you could go like miles in this thing. So there are ways to incorporate accessibility. I have a friend who I can actually connect you with more, who does a lot of work in this, with that. I can connect you via social media or her email or whatever, who does a lot of work with accessibility, whether it's in cultural institutions or whether it's with land institutions.
That would be great. Jane, I know you have your hand raised. Would you like to unmute?
Yeah, I think I'm specifically interested in language around people with disabilities, and I've run into sort of two different schools of thought, but separating the fact that they're people from the fact that they have a disability. And as I was writing a grant application, I found, after I had written it, a different school of thought, and I'm having a lot of trouble about how to speak to how we're changing the building to make it fully accessible and inclusive.
Yeah, I think I don't necessarily, I'm going to have to connect you with my friend. She's going to be very helpful with the terms of the language used for accessibility issues. She'll know way better than I am. So shoot me an email and and I'll connect you with her then.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? I'm gonna look in the chat. A few resources have been shared at the chat, in the chat, so be sure to take a look at that. Any other questions for Heather while we've got her here? See, it looks like Birdability.org was just shared into the chat as a resource as well. Vivian, I see your hand is raised. Feel free to unmute.
Thank you. This has been of great help to learn all this, even though I've been reading other things, but just hearing from you and all your explanation of the nuances has been tremendously helpful. I would like to learn more. If you could take a few minutes now or refer us to resources to something you've already referred to, which are trails, nature trails, which are of interest, I think, to a lot of people on this webinar. So anything further that you could say about signage or apps or how to incorporate along with everything else that people want to include in trail interpretation, how to incorporate in a respectful way the Indigenous history. Thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. You're welcome. I have been part of the creation of some signage throughout the Hudson Valley area, but also Western Massachusetts and things like that in my capacity when I worked for a tribal nation. I had the privilege of doing that. And I think one thing, number one, it can be done. You can include signage. It's not difficult. Number two, I think it's also really important to work closely with the, Indigenous people that you're trying to honor. So throughout Massachusetts, there's several different tribes that you're going to use from the west all the way to the east coast, whether it's Stockbridge-Munsee, whether it's the Wampanoags, Nipmunks, whoever. So I think it's important to work with that tribe, particularly if it's their history that you're trying to tell. The signage doesn't have to be long, and it doesn't have to be, like paragraphs. You can get a lot said in a few lines. And so I think that's probably one of the most important things that you can do is to work with those nations, but then also have signage along your trails that's visible, that people can see, that isn't overgrown by whatever vegetation is in that area. So I think that's really important to note as well. But yeah, it can, I've done some work on it, but I think, working with other organizations that have also gone through that process, I think can be really helpful.
Thank you.
Do a last call for questions. All right.
Seeing a lot of thanks and deep appreciation for what you've brought forward today, Heather. So
my pleasure. Thank you. And I will definitely send the resource list out so that all those in this can get it.
Wonderful. So I'll just share a final thank you for everyone for joining. Thank you, Heather, for facilitating this incredibly important workshop and learning about the words and phrases and actions that perpetuate harmful stereotypes. And what you've shared with us today will certainly lay the foundation for us all to do better and to move forward in teaching others. I'll also share that folks can be in touch with Heather, as she mentioned already, but to work, you could hire her to work more one-on-one with your organization. And lastly, we will follow up with all the resources that Heather has shared and the recording as well.
Perfect. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate you taking some time out of your morning to learn a little something you didn't know before. And so thank you so much.
thanks, everyone. Thank you so much, Heather.